The Fall of the Third Reich, a story of the end of Nazi Germany. The winter of 1945 was bitterly cold, but the freezing winds that swept across the remnants of Nazi Germany were not just from the skies, they came from the crumbling foundations of a regime that had once held Europe in its iron grip. For years, Adolf Hitler's Third Reich had marched through Europe with an unmatched ferocity, but now, in the closing months of World War II, the tide had turned. The enemies of Nazi Germany had surrounded it from all sides, and its fall was imminent. It was January, and the Soviet Red Army, relentless and hungry for vengeance after the brutal siege of Leningrad and the atrocities of war, was closing in from the east. In the west, the Allies, led by American and British forces, had already crossed the Rhine River and were advancing into the heart of Germany itself. The dream of a thousand-year Reich was collapsing under the weight of its own hubris, brutality, and defeat. In the heart of Berlin, deep within the fortified Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler sat surrounded by his closest advisors. The once invincible dictator had become a shadow of his former self, a man whose once fiery speeches had ignited the flames of war, now isolated, paranoid, and consumed by delusion. His plans for global domination lay in ruins. His allies had either deserted him or fallen, and his trusted generals, once loyal to the end, whispered of surrender in the corridors of power. Hitler refused to listen. He issued desperate orders for counteroffensives that no longer had the means to succeed, calling on phantom divisions that existed only on paper. His refusal to acknowledge the reality on the ground, cities destroyed, armies broken, and his people in despair, only hastened the end. By April, Soviet forces had reached the outskirts of Berlin. The city, once a shining symbol of Nazi power, was now a burning ruin. Streets were filled with rubble, and its people were trapped between the advancing Soviet soldiers and the fanatical remnants of the SS, who refused to surrender. Civilians cowered in basements, fearing not just the bombs that fell daily, but the horrors that awaited them as the city fell. Inside the Führerbunker, the mood was grim. Those still loyal to Hitler knew that the end was near. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, remained by his side, convinced that it was better to die with the Führer than face the shame of defeat. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, had joined him in the bunker, determined to stand by him until the very end. As the Soviets closed in on the Reichstag, Hitler made his final decisions. He had no intention of being captured alive. He had seen what had happened to Mussolini in Italy, whose body had been desecrated by his own people. On April 30, 1945, with the Soviets just blocks away from his underground bunker, Hitler took his own life, along with Eva Braun, in an act of defiance and escape. Their bodies were hastily burned in the courtyard above the bunker, as the sounds of Soviet artillery drew ever closer. The news of Hitler's death spread quickly through the remnants of Nazi leadership. It was a death knell for the Third Reich. With their Führer gone, many Nazi officials scrambled to negotiate surrender, though a few diehards fought on. On May 2, 1945, Berlin finally fell to the Soviets. Nazi Germany had lost its capital, and the surviving generals began the process of laying down their arms. On May 7, 1945, in the French city of Reims, Germany's High Command signed an unconditional surrender to the Allied forces. The next day, May 8, became known as Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, as the world celebrated the end of the war in Europe. Crowds cheered in the streets of London, Paris, Moscow, and New York, rejoicing in the long-awaited peace. The war had claimed millions of lives, and the scars it left behind would last for generations, but the nightmare of Nazi rule was finally over. The Nazi regime had fallen not just because of the military might arrayed against it, but because it had been built on hatred, cruelty, and a fundamental disregard for human dignity. In the years that followed, the Nuremberg trials would bring many of its leaders to justice, revealing to the world the full extent of the horrors they had perpetrated. But for now, in the rubble-strewn streets of Berlin, the silence of defeat hung heavy in the air. The empire that had once promised glory and conquest had ended in fire and ashes. And so, the Nazi regime passed into history, a stark reminder of the darkness that can consume the world when hatred, fear, and violence are allowed to take root. But from that darkness, the world vowed to rebuild, to remember, and never again let such evil rise unchecked.